Okay, good morning, good afternoon. Thank you very much, you all, for attending this panel session. My name is Javier Guarnizo. I am the director of the Office of Evaluation and Internal Oversight in UNIDO, based in Vienna, Austria. And it is a real pleasure to me to moderate this panel. Let me introduce our panel members now. First of all, I would like to introduce Mr. Fasil Reda, the Country Programme Coordinator in Ethiopia, which is one of the case studies and examples that we will present how UNIDO conducted partnerships and how the evaluation is contributing to that through a transformational change and theory of change approach. Mr. Fasil Reda has more than 30 years experience in the public sector, international sector. He has been director of the Ethiopian Agricultural Research Institute. He later been director of the Ethiopian Agricultural Transformational Agency. And now he's working as country program coordinator, representing the government. He represents in this panel the people we serve, as we say in the UN system. The other panel member is Mr. Johannes Dobinger, my colleague in UNIDO. He has more than 25 years experience. He is an expert on international developmental evaluation in the field of industrial development. Mr. Dobinger has been representative of UNIDO in the Andean region in Colombia, based in Colombia some years ago. And he's currently the chief of the Independent Evaluation Division in my office. So it is a pleasure to be here, and we will now start with 3 short presentations, one each of us, to present and trigger some thinking on how to use theory of change to promote transformational change, to try to understand and frame better a developmental intervention or several developmental interventions, and how it can be used and is useful for an evaluation purpose. Next, please, let's start the presentation. So I'll start with a generic introduction. Next. What we expect from this session, all in all, and I hope we all will get the benefit of our discussions. We want to promote some learning about how to conduct evaluations at country level, very targeted, attached to national development priority sectors. We would like to foster discussions about the use of the theory of change as a tool to frame transformational change and to enhance country ownership and use of evaluation results, which is the purpose at the end of the day. And to learn about a real case from a recent evaluation of a flagship UNIDO PCP with the government of Ethiopia, to illustrate the use of the theory of change and to assess the impact drivers, the preconditions for transformational change in a multi-stakeholders developmental intervention. Next. Just a quick introduction. UNIDO is a specialized agency of the UN system that promotes industrial development for poverty reduction, inclusive globalization, and environmental sustainability. As you know, we are based in Vienna, Austria, and we are closely connected to the SDG 9. We are kind of custodian of the SDG 9, but of course we contribute to a big or less extent to all the SDGs through our mandate. So we are promoting, according to our recent mandate, inclusive and sustainable industrial development in our member states. Next. And where is the evaluation function within UNIDO? So this is just the organigram, no need to go to the details. One click first, next. And the Office of Evaluation and Internal Oversight is co-located in the Office of the Director General, and we have operational independence. We report to the Director General, and we also report to member states directly. And within the office, we have 2 divisions, the Independent Evaluation Division and the Internal Oversight Division that covers internal audit and investigation functions. Next. So at the end of the day, these functions are all about promoting accountability and assure accountability, support management to have a more effective and efficient organization, to drive learning and innovation, to give assurance on governance, internal control, and risk management, to inform and provide confidence to stakeholders, member states, donors, governments, and at the end of the day, to fit into programmatic and strategic decision making. And as any oversight function, we are based on three main principles, which is independence, credibility, and utility, as you may know. Next. So let's start now going to the main topic. First, next, please. UNIDO has a theory of change that I'm now drafting here in a very simple way. We start doing things as everybody. Next, 2 more clicks. And this pathway to change is a connected, linked process. We start on the bottom with what we do, the day-to-day activities, the operations, the use of people and money as resources at the end of the day. There is no other way. We are people, and we use money that are transformed through the way we do things. We produce outputs as UN organization. We deliver things. We will go into details in the next slide. And with that outputs, we expect and we think that UNIDO and member states work together in order to achieve changes that are on member states' side, next, in order to contribute to a better world. So there is a connection and a pathway of transformation that has to be seen and has to be understood. And of course, has to be customized. Every country is not the same, every reality is not the same, every agency is not the same in the system. This theory of change will provide a tool to understand and frame how this is connected and where are the key elements to take attention in order to move this pathway forward. Next. And the evaluation function in our case in UNIDO, which is complementary to internal audit and investigation, external auditor or other committees as external providers, is more or less looking from this way. There are overlaps, of course, but evaluation is trying to look from the developmental side, from the member state side, if things are being achieved, if what is working, what's not working, and how things can be better, more efficiently and more impactful generated from our point of view. Next. So now let me introduce the full theory of change of UNIDO. So the short version is this. So we want to move from somewhere, from today or from yesterday, to a 2030 SDGs achievement in the long run. And time is flying, time is moving on, and integration and scale up is what has to happen at the end of the day. Next. So we have, as I mentioned in the previous slide, these 5 arrows, main arrows that start from people and money, what we do in UNIDO, what UNIDO delivers, what UNIDO member states do together, what member states achieve by their own, based on their commitment and ownership, and how this contributes to a real better world by 2030 agenda. Next. So in the area of what we do is basically the UNIDO resources and infrastructure devoted to help member states and people in member states. We have basically 2 main locations, headquarters here in Vienna and around 50 offices in the field. Headquarters provide policies, process, systems, fundraising, technical cooperation backstopping, integrate operations, monitoring and reporting. And on the ground, on the field, we are part of the United Nations country teams. We contribute to UNDAFs and the development frameworks now. We contribute and promote monitoring and reporting to governments and partners. We have a big convening role and communication. We try to put together different actors within the country, the government, private sector, partners, etc. And of course, we keep identifying and developing projects and programs on the ground. Next. That's what we do. What we deliver at the end of the day is through our operations, a big portion of technical cooperation, programs and projects, interventions. We support, advise with policy analysis and help member states to develop industrial policy, for instance. We produce and promote norms and standards on the industrial sector, and we keep doing the convening and partnership role, which is very important because sometimes in member states themselves is not granted that, for instance, ministers, different ministers work together, not necessarily. Like in the public sector, putting them together, putting different agendas together is a big role that the UN have as a neutral broker. And that's one role that we play a lot. And of course, we also deliver together with other partners in the system, United Nations agencies, developmental financial institutions, or private sector outputs, programs, training, infrastructure, etc. And that is supposed to build that green big arrow there that should strengthen national capacity. So whatever we do is not for producing a change in the number 4, a better word. Whatever we do in the system is basically creation of capacities, strengthening capacities in member states. Next, please. In order to them, with, of course, UNIDO in our case as well, promote, operationalize the inclusive and sustainable industrial development, which at the end of the day has to be reflected in economic development, in the people being better. But this is not one shot. So we develop and help in drafting and adopting industrial policies, investments, infrastructure, more partnerships, promote innovation. But from the outputs we deliver to this is not one link only. Next, please. There is a process, a repetition that has to be conducted more on the member state sides, still with our helps. In order that to happen, we produce a pilot, and the pilot has to be replicated. We produce a draft industrial policy with member states, and member states have to take on board and go to the parliament, discuss in the government, and make it approval and enforcement. So there is a process that is permanent, being run at that level. And this is already with member states on the driver's seat, not the agencies or the UN system in the driver's seat, but something that has to be there. And that is the crucial link to move on. If that link is not working like this, is not moving ahead and building up more, the chain is broken. And we may be delivering many outputs in the system, but if that green arrow is not moving, the next step of developmental results are not going to be achieved. Then based on that, member states, the next arrow, thank you, will further replicate and scale up, will find financing, will promote more of this across the country with a bigger scope at national level. And then we can finally see the national development priorities of any country being achieved. SDGs, more employment, more income, more better distribution of welfare, etc., etc. Click again first. And then based, one more click. And then again, this is a process in member states that need a replication and scale up. Is a permanent process that is moving from the infrastructure that was delivered by the system to member state key ownership and commitment to keep up doing that and further scaling and replicating the developmental interventions results. And only there we can see the better world. One click first. So the role of the agencies in that level is basically a follow-up and accompanying to keep together, not in the driver's seat. Member states, governments, private sector on the ground have to be on the driver's seat, but we have a role, of course, of follow-up and accompanying to be on time to help to contribute to that movement. This seems easy, it seems straight, but it's not, because behind this simplification of the reality, of course, which is in one page, there are many preconditions, assumptions that have also to be explicit as much as we can, because many things may not work as it is drawn here. Next, please. So we have identified in this example for UNIDO 4 areas of assumptions and preconditions that we should keep an eye and we should be aware of. If not, this whole relationship of chain effect will never work. Next, please. And in these levels, as an example, we have these assumptions, preconditions on the area of the number 1 in what UNIDO does and what UNIDO delivers. If the integration and coordination between headquarters and field offices of UNIDO is not really coordinated, or field offices doesn't have skills, or there are not policies or system being compiled in the UNIDO area, in the area of number 1, of course, the change from within the number 1 from what we do in UNIDO and what we deliver will never happen. So there are a lot of things like these elements behind the scene that has to be also important. More important, in the B red triangle, we have, for instance, preconditions that are so important that sometimes we forget to realize, and we should always follow up, like projects and programs that have been delivering within the technical cooperation frameworks are planned and implemented thinking on the long-term developmental objectives. And that is not granted. Sometimes we focus too much on the outputs, on the implementation itself, that we forget that we are supposed to be connected to something else. Some other programs and projects are also running, and then we have to be sure they are connected. Monitoring and reporting also is not necessarily strong sometimes, and the capacity to have an evidence-based reporting is needed. And of course, as an example, in the C point, in the C triangle, we have that further financing and stability of national policies. If they are not there, if there is a lot of weaknesses on that, this arrow, the second green big arrow, will never move, will be stuck, and then the next levels will not be achieved. So this is the picture we are using in UNIDO, and at the end of the day, it was started with evaluation thinking, but now is being used even to design, to implement, to monitor, and to report on developmental programs. And that is the example that we will now show you, which was being just conducted recently for the case of Ethiopia and the Partnership Country Programme of UNIDO. Next. So this is just for you to keep our resources and information of UNIDO. And next. And let me then give the floor to Mr. Fasil Reda to talk a little more on the UNIDO partnership with Ethiopia. Fasil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Javier. Good afternoon in Asia. My name is Fasil Reda. I am from the UNIDO regional office in Addis, in Ethiopia. I'm going to be talking in the next few slides, try to introduce the flagship program we have been implementing since 2015, called PCP, Program for Country Partnership, designed to help promote inclusive and sustainable industrial development, which is the core mandate of UNIDO, given by member states in the General Conference in Peru, Lima, Peru, in 2014. And of course, inclusive and sustainable industrial development has made it into the SDGs as well. It is part of the SDG 9. That's what I'm going to talk about. Next, please. Like I said, PCP is a new operational model designed to promote inclusive and sustainable industrial development. And yeah, okay, so the member states decided to promote inclusive and sustainable industrial development in the developing world. And they have conducted back-to-back general conferences in Vienna. And they decided to come up with this operational model called the PCP. And they said they cannot practically implement PCP across the board. And they had to select pilot countries. And there were 3 pilot countries selected for the implementation, the piloting of PCP. Ethiopia was one of them, and Senegal from Africa, and then Peru from Latin America. That's when we started implementing PCP. Next. So although the conceptualization was of that of UNIDO, the program was fully owned and driven by the host country government, by the government in Ethiopia. It was fully embraced by the government, and it was focusing on the priority sectors in the industry sector and the intervention areas in the industry sector, aligned with the transformational agenda of the country, the national industrialization strategy in the country. And it has this is basically a multi-stakeholder platform, and it has helped to mobilize large-scale public and private investment to fund industrial infrastructure development, as I am going to explain in a bit. And the multi-stakeholder platform has helped us also to really coordinate all partner, donor supported programs and projects designed to support the agro-industry development in the country. Next. The PCP couldn't have come at a better time for Ethiopia. Ethiopia was really pursuing its transformational agenda, the Growth and Transformation Plan, with very ambitious targets to become a middle-income economy by 2025, increase industrial contribution to GDP from 15 to 28%, and increase the manufacturing sector contribution, which was very low, to 18% by 2025. So the PCP couldn't have come at a better time. That's why it was fully embraced by the government. Next. So the PCP is not a standalone program, but an integral part of the economic development strategy of the country. And the economic development strategy, especially the industrial development strategy of the country, has prioritized three sectors. Agriculture-linked sectors, of course, for obvious reasons, because we are an agrarian country. So the agriculture-linked sectors were prioritized, as you can see on your left in the slide. Agro-food processing, textile and apparel, leather and leather products were the sectors selected, prioritized for industrial development, for rural industrialization in this country, because that's where the majority of our population is, in the rural areas. So for off-farm job creation, and also to move the country from a primary product producing and exporting country to a value-added industrially processed products producing and exporting country. So to link the economic development with the farmers, to link with the economic development and provide markets for the farmers, and to improve the export potential of the country, these private sectors were selected. Next. Also, other cost-cutting interventions were as well considered. Next. So to cut the long story short, please go back. So the PCP, one of the milestones, there were many milestones, but one of the major milestones, again, UNIDO, because of its role as a policy advisor and a technical arm of the government, it was a brain behind all of this. And it has helped the government produce the agro-industry development strategy back in 2009, which has led to the pilot integrated agro-industrial park initiative. Again, UNIDO has helped develop the feasibility study, the detailed engineering design and the specification, and environment and economic impact studies for these 4 pilot integrated agro-industrial parks that are going to be developed across the country in 4 regions, in 4 major regions. And one of the milestones, key milestones and key contributions of the partnership framework, again, the multi-stakeholder partnership framework platform, was in mobilization of huge resources, financial resources from the public and the private sector. And we have managed, the PCP has managed to mobilize over 1.25 billion USD to finance this industrial infrastructure development. It's not only the pilot integrated agro-industrial parks, also we are also financing a Mojo Laser City, state-of-the-art laser industrial cluster, and many other industrial infrastructures in this country. And encouraged by the high level of commitment of the government, many partners have come to the fore also with their own contributions in terms of finance. The EU, Italian bilaterals, multilaterals, and the development financial institutions, as you can see in the pie chart below in this slide. Africa Development Bank and the European Union, huge amount of financing to support the industrial infrastructure development of the country. Next. Like I said, the pilot integrated agro-industrial parks are now very much advanced. This is a old picture. So 4 pilot integrated agro-industrial parks running into the investment is almost close to 2 billion. And there is so much hope that these pilot integrated agro-industrial parks will help to promote rural industrialization in this country. Next. So I am going to discuss what were the success factors for PCP. First and foremost, it is a high level of commitment of the government. As you can see in this slide, is just one example. When we launched the pilot integrated agro-industrial parks initiative, as you can see, the former Prime Minister and the 3 sectoral ministers, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Industry, and others, and also at regional level, also the regional administrators down below the 3 regions, the regional administrators and with their full cabinet attending and leading PCP and leading the flagship projects that are under the partnership framework. This was one of the major success factors, the ownership and the commitment of the government. Next. And no, next. And again, no, next. So it was all about partnerships. No single agency or single government can pull it off on its own. So partnership was at the center of everything. So we had the development financial institutions, the bilaterals and the multilaterals. But most importantly, UNIDO was the brain behind all of this. It was a technical arm of the government, and it has started from developing the agro-industry development strategy of the country, which led to initiating the pilot integrated agro-industrial parks, to resource mobilization, to coordination, to investment promotion. It was serving as the technical arm, starting from the conceptualization of the PCP model itself. Next. So the other major success factor was we had in place a coordination structure that was evolving with time to fit changing circumstances. When we launched the PCP in Ethiopia, we had a joint steering committee on the top, state ministers and directors, and the National Technical Task Force of experts and sub-sector working groups. Next. And when the government saw the efficiency and effectiveness of PCP, they wanted to escalate, and the ministers wanted to participate in driving the PCP. So we had a National Transformational Council on the top. The Joint Steering Committee remained there, the state ministers, but one tier below. And we had different task forces as well established. Next. Now, as we move on, and the integrated agro-industrial parks, the modular cities, the industrial infrastructure development is on fast track. The government wanted, now it is time to really consolidate and streamline the coordination structure of the government. So we have Interministerial Coordination Committee of Ministers on the top, Interministerial Coordination Committee of State Ministers down below, and the decision that has been made very recently is that the PCP was such a success, the government decided to institutionalize it and expand the scope of operation, the mandate and the scope of operation of the PCP itself. So they want to expand the role, the scope, and the mandate of the PCP Secretariat itself, with representations as the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Finance, and as the Regional Industrial Park Development Corporations going forward. That's where I am going to stop. Thank you for your attention, and I hand over to Johannes.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to be in this session. Good to have you. My part is now touching on the final part, which is the evaluation of the PCP that we just heard as an example for how UNIDO is using the theory of change approach. Next. Just to give you a bit of a description of the evaluation, how we did it. Of course, the ambition was to assess the relevance and the results primarily of the PCP in Ethiopia that as it was implemented before for 4 to 5 years between 2015 and 19. And for UNIDO, this was the first evaluation of a PCP, so it was important to understand how this new approach of large-scale partnership is working. And of course, it was important to see within this partnership for UNIDO how UNIDO is contributing. Now, the evaluation approach, as you can imagine, in this kind of endeavor, it is very difficult to use quantitative methods only and to for example, a randomized approach. You cannot easily compare a country with a PCP with a number of countries with a control group and without PCPs. The intervention is much too complex. It is a partnership with a lot of different, very different activities that all contribute to the same goals. So, of course, qualitative methods had to be used, and the theory of change was a logical way of going about it. Of course, there were also, for parts of the interventions, quantitative analysis used. The evidence base that we had was a lot of documentations, of course, on the different activities, be it from UNIDO or the partners. We did a lot of interviews of stakeholders and development partners, and we also went to see directly the interventions in the agro-industrial parks. Next. And here is what I want to focus on in this presentation, which is the theory of change, to explain a little bit how we used it. What you see here on the left side, I hope you can see it clear enough on your screens, is a theory of change model that what had been developed already in the midterm review of the PCP in 2017. And what we did is we revisited this theory of change in order to assess in how far we found this theory of change is working out. And what you can see here that if you look at the lowest level, the blue boxes, the PCP is based on a number of features that need to be in place for PCP to work. They focus on selected priority sectors, because you cannot just say we're gonna industrialize Ethiopia with a single program. So you cannot support at the same time all the industrial sectors. So the focus is important. The multi-stakeholder partnerships are important, meaning that it's not only a few partners, it needs to be a critical mass of actors involved. Large-scale resources need to be mobilized, and the coordination between government entities needs to be improved, and the strong ownership needs to be in place. So this is, you can see also part of this in the preconditions that need to be there for a PCP to be started in the first place. You have them listed on the right side: government ownership, the government leadership, but you also need to have a basic infrastructure, of course, in place: roads, energy, ports. Otherwise, you cannot build everything from scratch. So those preconditions were in place. And now if you then move up the theory of change, you see that there are several interventions. Technical assistance projects, typically these take the form of advising on increasing the productivity of agro-industrial enterprises, in raising quality standards of products, etc. Then there is also an intervention to provide advice for to the government for institutional strengthening, for policy making. And third, there is the creation of the partnership as such, which needs to be molded, and that takes some time. In the evaluation, it came out clearly that it takes more time than was originally expected. And then there is the coordination aspect that UNIDO provides. Now, what you can see here, if you look at the boxes, there are pluses and minuses. So what we did in this evaluation exercise, we went back to this theory of change from the midterm review, and we checked in how far these the pieces of the interventions and the expected immediate changes and outcomes are really in place, and in how far also the assumptions, the external factors are in place as expected, and the preconditions. That's how you see the pluses and minuses. And maybe if you look at the one box that is in the middle of the second yellow row, the enhanced private sector investment, you can see that there is 3 minuses. This was one of the key findings of the terminal evaluation, that when we observed the PCP and its performance, it seemed to be extremely successful because the agro-industrial parks were really shaping up. Many partners put resources together, the EU, different banks, the different bilateral donors, and of course, and first and foremost, the government of Ethiopia, which had invested significant resources to construct the agro-industrial parks. So this all worked out, but the private sector investment in this theory of change was expected to come at a relatively early level, intermediate change 1. And we couldn't see that yet. And that was, it came out quite clearly that it wasn't also realistic to expect it to come at that time, because the agro-industrial parks, the infrastructure was not yet ready. So what we did is we adjusted the theory of change to better reflect the reality as we saw it now. Next. And that is then the new theory of change, where we identified new assumptions. We identified a couple of impact drivers, which are to a large extent responsible for the good performance that we found in the PCP Ethiopia, and which had not been done in the first theory of change. So what you can observe here is that the private sector investment now is one of the key factors that comes as one of the main outcomes actually of the whole endeavor of the PCP. So all the work that is done at the lower levels, at the first interventions, the technical assistance, the policy advice, and the different projects and policy changes that are then introduced are conducing towards more private sector investment. And for this private sector investment, of course, there is a number of assumptions that need to be in place also for this to be possible. And you can see on the right side, we listed a number of these impact drivers and assumptions. We found that Ethiopia PCP is a very particular case, that first of all, this kind of program, of industrialization program, can work in a country like Ethiopia because the government is very open to market interventions, while other countries are not. So you cannot just replicate this example in a country that has a more market liberal approach, and maybe a different PCP would have to have from the beginning a much more private sector driven emphasis. Then UNIDO at the beginning of the PCP already had a rather large scale cooperation portfolio, so it had built a network and a knowledge of the industrial issues in the country that helped to start to hit the ground running when the PCP started. And then, of course, what facilitated was the rather high levels of official development assistance in Ethiopia that made it more easier to mold the partnership and bring many cooperation partners on board. Then, in terms of assumption, one of the assumptions that, of course, needed to be refined was that significant financial resources can be made by development partners. That is something you need to check when you start a PCP in a different country in the first place. Then the complexity of these large-scale infrastructure investments are not to be underestimated. They take a long time, and the question is whether all the partners would have this long breath to stay with the program. And then, of course, there is security issues that need to be, especially with regard to the private sector investment, to be taken into account. If major security issues arise, private sector investment and the investment climate will suffer, of course. Good, we can then enter into more detail if you have questions on this theory of change in the question and answer session. Next. So the evaluation ended with concluded with a number of recommendations. It clearly recommended to extend the PCP and continue it, continue the focus on the flagship projects, which is the agro-industrial parks especially, but also second one, which is the Mojo Leather City. And then one more recommendation that I want to point out is, of course, that full attention in the next phase need to be given to private sector investment. In particular to the agro-industrial parks private sector investment. The key lessons learned from this was that impact drivers need to be taken into account from the beginning. They make a huge difference. You need those impact drivers to for a PCP to work, and the ones that were in place in Ethiopia were the ones that I already mentioned, the key government priority on industrialization, the openness to intervene in the market, good levels of ODA, and the expertise UNIDO already had to facilitate this partnership. But in a different country, those might different impact drivers, but they need to be in place. And a number of challenges that PCPs have to face in contrast to typical traditional technical cooperation, the longer time horizon of the program as such, also the longer time needed to bring the development partners on board, and to be as early as possible in ensuring that private sector is also committed to the PCP. So in a nutshell, I think the theory of change turned out to be a very useful approach to communicate to management and to the stakeholders and to the government of Ethiopia whether the PCP has worked and where it worked better and where it didn't work so well, and where we need to emphasize on putting more resources or in which direction to go in the next phase. And yeah, with that, I give the floor back to Javier, and thanks for your attention.
Many thanks, Fasil and Johannes. We are now going to open the floor for question and answers. You can write in the Q&A or the chat your comments, questions, and we will open a discussion. As a first summary, you could see now how a model, a tool, which is the theory of change, can be applied in a practical way to a concrete case where you can identify then where to focus if you want that pathway to move on. You can identify where you should pay more attention in order that pathway, that roadmap to be implemented. You can see, and as Johannes said, you can see and communicate in a nutshell what we are talking about and what are we part of, what is the big picture on which we are contributing and together with others. So that is the value of this framework. And now then let me open this with, we have a couple of questions already. So let me then read them and ask the panelists to comment. I'm also part of the panelists as well as moderator, but I'll also provide comments as needed. So there is a first question asking, what is the difference between the theory of change and the theory of action? And when do you use theory of change and theory of action respectively? So if Johannes or Fasil can comment on that, and I also can have a comment on that.
Yeah, if you want, I can try to answer that question. Well, the theory of action is rather a new thing. It has not been used widely in the UN evaluation context, but the difference, if you look at the theory of change that we just presented for Ethiopia, it lays out the overall pathway to the big results. It does not go too much into the detail of what the interventions actually do. And that is what a theory of action does. A theory of action analyzes more how the actual things that you do. For example, if you have an outcome that is, you need to train farmers on to increase their productivity. So the outcome is increased productivity of smallholders that then will be providers of raw material for the agro-industrial parks. Now, there are many ways you can do that to increase the productivity of the smallholder farmers. You can do training courses, you can do extension services, so you can channel your resources. For example, Fasil will know all these issues. You can channel resources into supporting government institutions that provide assistance to farmers, but you can also say, okay, let's do it in the project, and we hire staff that go directly to the farmers, which is of course a less sustainable solution. But you can also maybe not even do it without, through this you can just say, okay, let's deliver better tools to the farmers. So we will purchase the tools. So if you purchase tools and give them out freely to the farmers, then you can develop a theory of, okay, what will that do? The theory then, of course, the assumption is they will use these tools and they will increase their productivity within a certain time horizon so much that the next set of tools they can purchase themselves. Things like that is then a theory of action that is going much more in detail of what you do, whereas the theory of change is giving you the overall picture of the logic from increased productivity of the farmers to well-operating agro-industrial parks and existence of a raw material supply, which in turn will bring in private sector investors because they need to have raw material supply. And then that will create new jobs, and that contributes to the SDGs. That is more the overall picture that the theory of change gives you. I hope this makes it clear.
Fasil, any comment on this? There are many other questions that are coming. So
no.
Okay, maybe just
yes, there are many questions coming. So
yes, let me just again frame the answer from Johannes as a concrete experience and comment as anecdotal things. Sometimes the theory of action are developed without theory of changes behind, or explicit theory of changes, and then that is a risk for interventions because they may end in an isolation, so in a disconnection to not only reality but to the developmental pathway that the theory of change frames, shows conceptually. So as Johannes says, the theory of change is more this overview, helicopter view of a developmental pathway, and a theory of action is more an action-oriented element that is addressing, implementing, operationalizing that theory of change in the areas that need to be actioned in order to move that forward. So thank you for the question and answer. So we have another one very interesting in terms of concrete elements. To what extent, maybe that's for Fasil, to what extent were the partnerships successful in terms of generating synergies in the case of the Ethiopia, for example, and what were the success factors of partnerships? What were the challenges encountered for successful partnerships?
Thank you, Javier. This is a very relevant question. I mean, the partnership framework, PCP, what it did for us was that it created a platform. I mean, in the countries, the reality was that we were suffering from this institutional divide, fragmentation of activities. And when this partnership framework came into being, all partners brought their relative strengths to bear and really contribute to a common goal. And all partners were engaged according to their area of interest, according to the sphere of their influence. So that really motivated all partners to really come under this framework and bring about the synergy and complementarity of programs and activities. And what we did was also resource mapping within the PCP framework. So to see who is doing what in the agro-industry space, again, because of the coordination framework we have with all partners, where all partners have a say. And so we developed that database, who is doing what, and so through the Interministerial Coordination Committee, we were able to see how we can create synergy and complementarity among the projects and the programs that are going on. What were the success factors of partnerships? Well, like I said, first of all, it is to engage partners according to their interest and their sphere of influence, and also the task sharing arrangements within the coordination structure. So all partners have their specific roles within the partnership framework. So they were actively engaged in moving and in leading this partnership framework, and that was a success factor for me. What were the challenges encountered? Initially, we had challenges because building partnership is not an easy task. Some of our partners thought this was a single agency initiative or whatever it is, and why bother? And what we did was we identified champions within the high-level officials to convince, to do several consultations, one-on-one consultations and partner consultations to show them that there is a common good here, that it is about contributing to the industrialization of the country. And so many came back on board and contribute their share. So using champions to reason with partners to make them see the vision. So this really contributed to overcome the challenges we faced initially.
Thank you, Fasil. There are coming many questions. Let me summarize a few of them that are related, and I think it's a very good topic for further thinking. For instance, is the theory of change still an ideal tool to chart out of the path of transformational change, which is not a linear path, is a static or a dynamic tool? And then on a concrete point, the main challenge for sustainable industrial development in agri-industry context is how to help and support the mindset change of farmers and stakeholders, because a lot of farmers only focus in plantation and not in an industrial long-run development. So all this is, I think, connected, and I would appreciate comments from Johannes and Fasil on this.
Johannes, if you could speak about the theory of change, and I will go for the agro-industry. Yeah.
Okay, so if you look at the importance of if you look at the theory of change, that we presented. I guess we cannot bring it back now, but it's we had both theory of changes, the one for UNIDO and the one for the PCP, and that goes also into the question that is coming up. It clearly shows the importance of the partnership in both theory of change, as in UNIDO as well as in the PCP Ethiopia. The same goes for the technical assistance. This is how the overall connection of the theory of change organization-wide cooperative is reflected then also in the theory of change of the PCP case in Ethiopia, and it demonstrates exactly how the convening of the partnership is essential for contributing to the next step, which is the investments and better industrial policies, increased agricultural and agro-industry productivity, and then do the private sector investments. I think that is how you can link it up to the theory of change.
So what about Mr. Fasil, what about the mindset change?
This is again a very relevant point. In our case, I can only speak for Ethiopia. In our case, we were more or less reaching a dead end because we were a country continuing to be a country developing a primary product producing and exporting country, and raw grain and live animals, and the commodity price was falling, and the farmers were suffering. So the time was very ripe for change, and that's when the government started to really invest in agro-industry development, and the farmers and the stakeholders saw the relevance of this path the government is trying to follow. So we were reaching a dead end. So the way forward was to build the agro-industry development, the agro-industry sector, and move into high-value product producing and exporting country. So that's why we were lucky in Ethiopia.
Thank you. A couple of questions related to the further use of theory of change. For instance, to what extent partners are engaged in development theory of change? To what extent theory of change can be used for programming, identification and programming purposes, not just on the last part, but in the starting and thinking of new interventions, and how useful it is and how it triggers further changes in the whole program and developmental change management. Johannes, any comments?
Yes. That is a very good question. I think there is different ways of applying theories of change, and one of the biggest differences that you can make maybe is between a theory of change that is developed by an evaluation team as a logical explanation of what is observed, or you can do it as a participatory exercise with all the stakeholders to also foster the common understanding of the program. In this case, in the Ethiopia, it was a bit of a mixture. It was a theory of change that was developed first in the midterm review, based on many interviews with the partners. But I was not myself involved in the 2017 exercise, but I understand it. I think it was not done in these typical workshop environments where you say you gather all the stakeholders for 1 or 2 or 3 days, and then at the end of the day you have a theory of change. It was rather a theory of change developed by the evaluation team, informed by many stakeholder interviews and the review of all the documents and the observations that were done. But in principle, I think it is the ideal situation is to have enough time and resources to do the theory of change as a participatory exercise, same way as it was done in the times of the logical framework. And maybe the question also in how far this can it be developed, can the theory of change be used for evaluation and also for design or planning? Yes, of course, it can be also used for design and planning. It's not an exclusive evaluation tool. And just as it was the case here in Ethiopia, it is for evaluation purposes, of course, a very good situation. When you go and evaluate, you find already the theory of change done by the design teams. And that is now in UNIDO a growing tendency, and that the design teams, they start with developing a theory of change, which is then part of the program design. And when it comes to the evaluation, then we look at the theory of change and revisit it, just as we did it here in the case of the Ethiopia PCP.
Thank you very much. There are a group of questions related to already partially answered, but let me just put some emphasis on some key points that are already raised in the questions. The engagement of stakeholders have been just mentioned is important, and I also would like to comment on that. A theory of change cannot be just an abstract standalone development process. Has to be a participatory, and like any other intervention to make a difference, has to be owned by the clients, in this case by member states. So the challenge is how to move further on that, how to embed a theory of change thinking, which is the cultural aspect, the mindset, not only in government, but also in institutions, in stakeholders, farmers, industry, to allow understanding and sharing understanding on the connections to national development, economic development of countries. So this is the discussion that has to trigger a theory of change as a tool. So it's not an end in itself, it's not an static. We promote the updating, like any project, program, or intervention is a live element that should be updated, should be kept updated when changes happen. And changes are so many that are reflected in the assumptions, preconditions, and drivers. And that's why the dynamic is there. So shouldn't be static, and is to be dynamic. But the most important is this sharing ownership of the tool and the use of the tool at the end of the day. There is no perfect theory of change. It's a tool for communicating and summarizing a reality, which is already complex and non-linear. But that is the beauty and the challenge of this. So making it over complex doesn't help, but also oversimplifying will not help. So has to be found a middle point on that, and that depends on each reality. I would like to emphasize here this mindset issue, and that is one of the elements, not only on the side of the UN institutions that we need to open that discussion further and implement internally, but also to promote that in member states in the engagement with them on how to look the roadmap to development as a bigger picture where we all are together working with our own roles and responsibilities. Let me point a couple of questions now that are very interesting in the questions. Most of them are already, maybe to point out this, which are the, Johannes, that was in this evaluation very engaged, in particular in Ethiopia, and Dr. Fasil as well. So what about the feedback and follow-up from government stakeholders and project staff about the theory of change? Did they make any modification as a result of the theory of change design so far? Did it apply or will be applied in a second phase of the project and programs of UNIDO? Johannes, Fasil?
Maybe I would prefer Fasil to...
May I go first? I mean, you know, it was...
Yes, Fasil.
Yeah, thank you, Johannes, Javier. Yeah, it was very much well received, the evaluation, the midterm evaluation as well as the terminal evaluation. And of course, it has created kind of clarity of purpose. You know, the leaders who are leading the flagship program, the partnership framework, the government officials, to think about impact drivers, what are conditions and assumptions that have to be taken into consideration. Since the midterm review, especially, we had clarity of purpose when we were clear on who should be doing what, contributing to this next level, and then partners, how do they perform, what are the relative tasks that they have to undertake. So this clarity of purpose and the clarity of tasks has been created, and the leaders were thinking about impact drivers, the assumptions, the conditions that they have to take into consideration. So this tool was very important in that regard. You can add, Johannes, on this.
Thank you, Fasil.
I think from my side, I don't have too much to add, but I think one of the topics I remember that were discussed in the framework of the evaluation is this key element of the private sector investments, that there was a clear consensus that there needed to be more attention to things like investment for and starting as early as possible to bring to move the attention to the private sector element of the PCP, and I think that is clearly something that the evaluation helped also to put into the center of attention of all the stakeholders involved.
Thank you.
If I may add on this point, Javier, if I may add on this point, yeah, this is a very relevant point, because this was flagged for us by the evaluation, and we have conducted successive platforms for the private sector, and this has led to a large number of domestic investors lining up. Created awareness was created about the industrial infrastructure being built and the different incentives the government is coming up with, and that has led to quite a significant number of investors to come on board. Actually, we have already investors before even the infrastructure construction is completed. Some investors have already started processing the avocado oil, for instance, by a Dutch company in southern nations and nationalities at the Yirgalem Integrated Agro-Industrial Park site. And similarly, in the Amhara site also, a couple of investors already before the construction is completed. So already the private sector investment is coming.
Javier, I would like to briefly also touch upon one of the previous questions about whether the theory of change is static or dynamic. I find this question very interesting because it is, I think in most of the cases it's applied a rather static instrument, meaning that it is used at discrete points in time for the design and then for the review and the evaluation. But it's not an instrument that when at the time that when you use it, that shows you the dynamics very well in most of the cases, but you can use it as a more dynamic instrument. And actually we have been experimenting a little bit. We did in the case of a project evaluation in Indonesia of a project that supports the fisheries value chains, and where we used network analysis to combine it with the theory of change to show the dynamics. And there you can, using a number of quantitative analytical tools like the Demattel methodology, you can use that to introduce a more dynamic element in the theory of change by having a system logic. So you use network analysis to determine the main influencing factors that determine the performance of a value chain, and then you can run iterations of this model. But those things I think are still very much in a very early stage. But I hope that the theory of change discussion will, the professional community will develop the tool further to become even more dynamic in the future.
Great, many thanks. I would like to just brief that part, what Fasil and Johannes just mentioned, just to remind, clarity of purpose was mentioned by as a result of the theory of change used in Ethiopia case by Fasil, and I think that is one of the reasons of the theory of change, to gain a common understanding and move on that, to understand impact drivers and assumptions better in the overall developmental context, and to foster this ownership of government partners and bring new partners into action to the ground. So that is, I think, the relevant part. There is a very interesting question I really like in a personal level, and as I'm the moderator, I will also act as panelist and answer that, if you may. How can we monitor whether the theory of change is achieved? And I understand also, if I understand correctly, we also need to establish a set of sound indicators, a baseline to measure this. Is it right? Is a question on the theory of change. Let me kick off a comment on that, and of course, Fasil and Johannes can also bring it up. The question is relevant. I think measurement, monitoring on development is key. Without that, nothing can be really understood better. A theory of change, to my understanding, is not expected to have this set of KPIs to measure the whole thing, because it's an aggregated component of many interventions, many ideas, and many actions. The level of monitoring theory of change is in the level of the revision, periodic revision, and to check validity, to check if it is correct in the context, in the current context. And the monitoring of theory of change is basically to keep assessing the relevance and validity of the model. The real monitoring happens on the boxes that are the actions, the theory of actions within a theory of change, where the interventions have their own set of monitoring baselines and indicators that must be followed up and measured. The theory of change will then aggregate that and see if that is connected and validated. One of the key elements to me on the theory of change is to pay attention not to the boxes. If you remind the graphic of the theory of change, there are always boxes and arrows that connects boxes, moving on the developmental pathway. One of the most important elements on the theory of change that the theory of change brings is the attention to the arrows. Normally in the day-to-day of interventions at project program level, we don't pay attention to the arrows, these soft elements of developmental realities. And theory of change brings this up in a very explicit way, because the arrows are the key for moving from one level to another. Without the arrows and ensuring the arrows are properly in place and are real connections between programs, projects, interventions, stakeholders, money, etc., the developmental pathway will not be realized. So that is the other element to be always seeing on the theory of change. Probably the arrows are as important as the boxes in a theory of change thinking. And that brings the point of connection. We have to keep things connected. So that is a very good question. Any comment, Johannes, Fasil?
Well, from my side, I think when you do a theory of change, for example, as part of the project design, then the theory of change helps you to understand how the program or project is supposed to work, the logic. And then you translate it into a traditional results framework. You probably do a logical framework where you map out all your activities, outputs, expected outcomes, and you assign to them the indicators and KPIs that you define. And that is the connection to the theory of change, I suppose, and how it is you can monitor whether you can monitor the performance, whether the theory of change is working out. The second point I want to make here is attention that the theory of change draws to the external factors, meaning the impact drivers and the assumptions that need to be in place. And that is something that is in the traditional results framework oftentimes not maybe neglected, but not dealt with. Not a lot of attention is given to monitoring the external factors in the theory of change. They map out clearly the assumptions, and they then should also be part of the monitoring framework with indicators that help to measure whether assumptions are in place and impact drivers are in place.
Thank you very much. Let me pick another couple of comments and questions. Partially also answered, but good to reflect further on that. For instance, as the theory of change is also based on assumptions and drivers, which at times can be ideal but not realistic, which are the factors that are taken into consideration to develop those assumptions? How you deal with that? And related to that, let me put on the second question for further comments, that many stakeholders feel that theory of changes are complicated or too dense. How then we can make them simple and most importantly useful so that they are not just another annex in reports? Very good questions, comments. Johannes, any comment on that?
Well, I mean, the question about assumptions and the theory of change being not an ideal world, but a realistic one, brings us back to the question of the stakeholders involved. I think the art of it is also when you do a theory of change as program design to get a diverse set of actors, and not only those that are the ones that are already completely associated with the program. If you design the theory of change for agro-industrial parks by inviting only the Ministry of Industry and the donor who already provided money for it, and UNIDO who is all for doing this, then you might have a more ideal world in your theory of change. If you invite also the smallholder farmers, if you invite also maybe NGOs that look at the social and environmental framework conditions that need to be taken into account, the thing might change. And then the assumptions that you will define are more rich and more realistic. And so the art of it is, as it was also before already in the logical framework times, then that you do a real participatory design of the theory of change, inviting all the relevant stakeholders. And the second question, that TOCs are complicated or too dense, I think it has to do also with the time and resources that are available to discuss it. If you, of course, try to discuss quickly in a 2-hour session, you put yourself the objective to end the 2-hour session with a ready-made TOC, then everybody will suffer, because there is not time to discuss everything. So it will appear to be very dense. But if you have the reasonable time set aside, like 1 or 2 days or 3 days, even for a workshop where you meet again and you discuss the things, one element at a time, then I think it will not appear as complicated anymore.
Thank you. Just a complementary comment on this, in both answers to the two questions. The assumptions analysis is crucial, as has been mentioned already. Like any intervention project program, but also in theory of change, is all about trying to dig in what should be in place in order that the validity of the boxes and arrows in the theory of change are still valid, are still logic and consistent. And sometimes we discover in this analysis on the assumption discussion that there are things that are not in place, and probably the focus of the intervention at that moment should be to put in place that, and not to be just technically driven, for instance. So not just to start discussing trainings or development of infrastructure if, for instance, policy is not in place at a minimum level. And then, because we all assume sometimes, and this is not explicit in the developmental interventions, that a policy framework is in place. And more now we see that one of the areas that has to be further strengthening is policy framework. And not only the draft and the documents, but the enforcement of that in countries at ground level. And that is not a technical issue, it's more a political issue where the convening role happens and appears more explicit of organizations like UNIDO. And that is an area to be further strengthened. So that assumptions discussion, bring that to the table, bring that up in front of government and partners in the country level. And of course, then it brings the need to be addressed in order that the programs and projects, the technical driven traditional projects and programs from the UN system make a difference at the end of the day. If not, that those will remain just as a pilots and on the shelves. So that is the discussion that can be promoted through a theory of change lens analysis and discussion. And the complication or not complication on dense or not dense of the model itself, of course, is crucial, is one of the challenges. And there I insist the need of the engagement and foster ownership of the other side of the table, the governments and partners on the ground. It's not useful at the end of the day to have a beautiful theory of change, nicely drawn, very well developed in colors and dynamics and animations, if that is not owned by countries, by governments, by developmental partners on the driver's seat. So the complication or not is a trade-off that has to be in place in the discussion. And at the end of the day, it's very important not to forget that. It's very important to have a tool that is understandable, manageable, and serve the purpose, which is gain clarity, foster ownership, and move on this developmental roadmap. So we have one more question because this is gonna end very soon. It has run too quick the time. Let me pick one more question. Maybe important one. How do you integrate? Already answered partially, but I think maybe Fasil and Johannes can reflect on that. How you integrate the theory of change into policy formulation? Any comment on that?
Well, I
Johannes?
think I have to take it because we lost Fasil. Apparently,
yes,
the internet connection
yes.
was interrupted. So I think the policy cycle is very similar to the program and project cycle. So I think it is the same way you can use it for designing a policy. You can, at the beginning, start with problem analysis and then move forward to a theory of change development because the policy aims at defining certain, at achieving certain changes. So it's the same way you apply it through inviting all the stakeholders. The same principles apply. You should involve a diverse set of all the stakeholders that will be affected by the policy and map out how the policy is supposed to contribute to the expected, to the desired changes. So I think this is also already being applied in many cases. For UNIDO, many of our cooperation programs support the policy making process for industrial development. So, theory of change is also being used there.
Good, many thanks. Mr. Fasil has been disconnected, unfortunately, but we are now approaching the end. I just want to make a wrap up of the session. First of all, thank you all the participants and attendees and the panelists, of course, Johannes and Fasil, and the support from the Asian Development Bank on this panel. What we wanted at the beginning with this panel and session is to foster discussion on a broader thinking on the roadmap to developmental impact. And the impact to me is not other thing than change. And that is why the theory of change, I'm convinced, is a tool, is a good tool, but just a tool to promote and increase the clarity on objectives, on areas to work, on areas not to work, on roles and responsibilities of actors, government, UN system, developmental financial institutions, private sector, partnerships, etc. And at the end of the day, as the panel also answered, and several questions were about, is a mindset change approach that is needed. And that is not overnight, of course. There is a big movement now, and theory of changes in a practical way are being used actually, for instance, in UNIDO, in designing new interventions at intervention level, and trying to then see the whole picture within the intervention point of view and see if that is connected to this main development national program in countries and member states. So the value of the theory of change we see is there. We see it has to be further promoted and has to be used as a tool to discuss openly, honestly, with partners and internally in the UN system and externally with governments and partners, as a way to all of us move on this developmental agenda. I would like to thank again to the participants for the very good questions. I apologize for not having answered or addressed all the questions. There is a good number. We are taking note and recording the questions. We will use that in our further development of this approach in UNIDO. And there is one final comment that if the presentation will be shared, I understand the proceedings of the evaluation week will provide access to these documents, so that should not be a problem. And thank you again for your attention. So it has been a pleasure to moderate and share this panel with Johannes and Fasil. And I wish you all a nice rest of the week and nice day at the end of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.